the last survivors of a deadly human zoo, the dark world that inspired the story of Kunta Kinte. In 1906, visitors at the Bronx Zoo in New York gathered around a shocking attraction, not a wild animal, but a young African man named Ota Benga. Taken from the Congo and displayed beside an orangutan, he was cruelly labeled the missing link by newspapers and treated as a scientific curiosity. Crowds laughed, pointed, and mocked him, believing Africans were somehow less human. Ota Benga's tragic story exposed the same racist ideology that fueled slavery generations earlier, the same brutal system that inspired the story of Kunta Kinte in Roots. Even after slavery officially ended, dehumanization did not disappear. It evolved into human zoos, where African families were exhibited across America and Europe as entertainment for millions. Presented as education and science, these displays stripped people of their dignity, identity, and humanity. The story of Ota Benga remains one of the darkest forgotten chapters of modern history, a reminder of how racism once turned real human beings into public spectacles for the world to watch. When audiences first heard the story of Kunta Kinte through Alex Haley's Roots, millions were shocked by the brutality of slavery and the destruction of identity. Kunta Kinte became more than a character. He became a symbol of stolen heritage, resistance, and survival. But what many people do not realize is that the racism that captured Kunta Kinte did not end with slavery. Decades later, it evolved into horrifying spectacles like human zoos, where African people were publicly displayed as entertainment for white audiences across Europe and America. By the late 1800s, European empires controlled enormous territories across Africa and Asia. Colonial propaganda constantly portrayed Africans as primitive, uncivilized, and inferior. Governments needed ordinary citizens to support colonial expansion, so they transformed racism into public entertainment. World fairs and colonial exhibitions became wildly popular, attracting millions of visitors. These events showcased inventions, military power, and exotic cultures from conquered lands. But the most popular attractions were often not machines or technology. They were people, African people treated like living exhibits. Entire villages were recreated inside exhibition grounds. Families from Africa, the Philippines, Greenland, and indigenous communities around the world were transported thousands of miles away from home and forced to perform their daily lives before enormous crowds. Visitors watched them eat, dance, sleep, and exist as if they were zoo animals. In many ways, these exhibitions reflected the same mindset that once justified the capture of Kunta Kinte. Africans were no longer seen as individuals with histories and families. They became objects to observe, measure, and control. At the famous 1889 Paris Exposition, organizers displayed hundreds of Africans in reconstructed villages while more than 28 million visitors attended the fair. Similar exhibitions appeared in Brussels, London, Hamburg, and New York. Scientists promoted racist theories claiming Europeans represented the highest stage of human evolution while Africans stood closer to animals. Human zoos became proof for these theories. Families attended them as weekend entertainment, never questioning the cruelty behind the spectacle. The same racist thinking that tore Kunta Kinte from Africa centuries earlier continued shaping the modern world. Among all the victims of human zoos, the story of Ota Benga became one of the most tragic. He was born around 1883 in the Congo Basin among the Buti people. Then colonial violence shattered his world. Under Belgium's King Leopold II, the Congo Free State became one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. Villages burned, millions died from forced labor, executions, and starvation during rubber extraction campaigns. One day, slave hunters attacked Ota Benga's village, killing his wife and children before capturing him. Like Kunta Kinte generations before him, his life changed forever because of colonial greed. Eventually, Ota Benga was purchased by an American explorer named Samuel Phillips Verner, who was searching for African people to display at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Imagine surviving unimaginable violence only to be shipped across the ocean and placed on display before strangers. Crowds stared at Ota Benga while scientists measured his body and compared him to apes. The world treated him as less than human. It echoed the same dehumanization seen in the story of Kunta Kinte, where enslaved Africans were stripped of names, dignity, and identity the moment they arrived in America. But the worst humiliation came 2 years later at the Bronx Zoo. Administrators decided they could attract even larger crowds by placing Ota Benga inside the monkey house beside an orangutan. A sign outside listed his height, weight, and age exactly like an animal exhibit. Thousands arrived daily to stare at him. Some visitors poked him with sticks while others laughed as he used a bow and arrow. Newspapers published racist cartoons portraying him as half-human. The zoo defended the exhibit as scientific education, but in reality it was public humiliation disguised as entertainment. African American leaders immediately recognized the horror of what was happening. Ministers and activists protested furiously, arguing that displaying a human being inside a zoo was a crime against humanity. Reverend James H. Gordon demanded Ota Benga's release, calling the exhibit morally disgusting. Eventually, public outrage forced the zoo to remove him, but freedom could not erase the trauma he carried inside. Just as Kunta Kinte's scars represented the violence of slavery, Ota Benga carried emotional wounds that never healed. After leaving the zoo, Ota Benga tried desperately to rebuild his life in America. Friends helped him find work and attend school, but he constantly dreamed of returning to Africa. He longed to reconnect with the world stolen from him. Then World War I erupted, making travel across the Atlantic nearly impossible. Trapped in a country where he felt isolated and broken, he fell into deep depression. In 1916, after years of suffering, Ota Benga ended his own life. He was only around 32 years old. His tragedy became another painful reminder of the long shadow cast by the same history that began with people like Kunta Kinte. Human zoos continued for decades even after Ota Benga's death. In Belgium, African villages were still displayed during the 1958 Brussels World Fair, shockingly recent in modern history. Visitors threw food and bananas at African participants while photographers captured smiling crowds. In Germany, ethnological exhibitions displayed Inuit families, Sami people, Nubians, and others beside wild animals. Millions attended these events without recognizing the cruelty before their eyes. It showed how deeply racism had become normalized throughout Western society. What makes this history so disturbing is not only the cruelty itself, but how ordinary it seemed to people at the time. Families attended human zoos the same way modern families visit amusement parks today. Parents brought their children, couples took photographs, newspapers promoted exhibitions proudly. The people who watched these spectacles often considered themselves civilized and educated. Yet they participated in a system built upon the same dehumanization that enslaved Kunta Kinte and millions of other Africans centuries earlier. Today, the stories of Ota Benga and Kunta Kinte continue forcing the world to confront uncomfortable truths about history, racism, and identity. Historians still uncover forgotten photographs and testimonies from survivors of colonial exhibitions. Some museums and governments have issued apologies for their involvement, but the legacy of these human zoos still echoes through modern stereotypes, racial inequality, and the lingering wounds left by colonialism. History reminds us that cruelty often hides behind words like science, education, and progress. Kunta Kinte became a global symbol because his story represented millions whose identities were stolen by slavery. Ota Benga's story carries the same painful truth. Both reveal how systems of power stripped African people of dignity while convincing society that such cruelty was normal. Today, their stories survive as warnings, reminders that humanity is capable of terrible things when people stop seeing others as fully human. The human zoos of the past may be gone, but their lessons remain painfully relevant. Because history is not just about what happened long ago, it is about understanding how easily civilization can lose its humanity when prejudice becomes entertainment.